Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Movie Debates. In case this is your first time watching one of these, essentially this is a series on the channel where I have a friend on and we get into some kind of nerdy movie-related debate. And today I'm joined by my friend Danny to discuss what the best film in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe truly is. I'll be arguing for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, and he'll be arguing for Iron Man 1. So I'm going to kick it to my friend Danny, and he'll give you a bit of an opening statement about why he thinks Iron Man 1 is a cinematic masterpiece.
Well, Caleb, I didn't quite say that, but no, these are two great movies, so it's going to be a difficult debate, I think. I think a lot of people would have these in their top 5 to 10 of the MCU, and for good reason. They're both terrific origin stories, but we have to remember that Iron Man 1 started it all. Without the star power of Robert Downey Jr., without that first excellent movie, the rest of the MCU doesn't even exist. So we may not even get to Guardians of the Galaxy. I have a lot more specifics to say about the movie, but just kicking it off, Iron Man 1 started it off, to this day, may remain undefeated. 30, 40, whatever movies later, I don't even know how many there are anymore, and a million TV shows later. It's just a really excellent origin story. It took a character that was like a B-level superhero and turned it into an A-list level superhero comic book character. Yeah,
absolutely. I think Iron Man, and rightfully so, gets a ton of credit for A, kicking off the MCU, and then B, taking a lesser known Marvel character and really making him the kind of vocal point of the arguably the most, not even arguably, the most popular film franchise of all time. I guess I would push back a little bit against that because I would say Guardians of the Galaxy did that, but on steroids. Iron Man, while he wasn't a Captain America, Spider-Man, or Hulk figure, I'd say most people had at least heard of him. Like you said, he's kind of a B-level character. You get there's the Black Sabbath song. So I think people had at least heard the name or were vaguely aware of Iron Man, even if you weren't a diehard comic fan. Whereas with Guardians of the Galaxy, who the hell had heard of Rocket Raccoon before 2014?
That is true.
Who had heard of Groot? I really think James Gunn took these kind of D-level obscure characters and he made me care about a talking tree that could only say 3 words. And I just that is so impressive to me, where I went into Guardians of the Galaxy being I have no idea who these jobbers are. My expectations were really low, and I left that movie just feeling really endeared to all of them. So I think, rightfully so, Iron Man did a phenomenal job of really kind of building a pillar for the whole cinematic universe. But I would say Guardians of the Galaxy kind of did that with multiple characters, where leaving Iron Man 1, I love Tony Stark, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of just the Tony show. In that sense, if we're going to give Iron Man credit for doing that, I do think Guardians of the Galaxy just kind of did that, but on a higher, I guess, more impressive level.
Yeah, I definitely agree that Guardians of the Galaxy, those characters were a lot more obscure, and that they did do an excellent job bringing them to life. But I would argue that what Robert Downey Jr. did for Tony Stark and Iron Man became instantly more iconic than Guardians of the Galaxy ever will be. I just think that his version of that character is just going to be the definitive version of that character. Probably for our lifetimes, and possibly forever, who knows. But I just think that he became the face of the MCU right away. It is the Tony show, but it is Iron Man. And I feel like they just made that character as good as it possibly could have been. And I think that the job he did and the writers did bringing that character to life just became far more iconic instantly than any of the individual Guardians ever will become. And I do think they did a good job with that team, but I just think Iron Man and Tony Stark is a stronger character than anybody in Guardians of the Galaxy, personally.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. Though I do think a little bit of that is just also off the fact that Tony Stark is a more, consistent character throughout the whole saga, where he has, the most appearances, got an entire trilogy, is kind of the star of even the Avengers team-up films. So I do think partially that is from a little bit to the first film, of course, but also just seeing him more. He definitely has a more developed character arc throughout the entire saga, where you can kind of argue that the Infinity Saga is also in part a Tony Stark saga. So I think his kind of iconicness comes a little bit from that as well. And I guess I would argue that I think the emotional core of like the character arcs in Guardians, it just kind of hits me on a more deep emotional level. Like when I think of that cold open scene where Peter Quill's mother dies and he's like too afraid to take her hand. And then when we kind of bring that through thematically to the last third act fight where Gamora is reaching out to him and he like sees the vision of his mom. Like I think that's such a deep kind of emotional story that we don't really get too often in the MCU. And it kind of, that hit me on a deep level. Even the scene with Rocket Raccoon where, you know, he's like drunk in a bar and he's like fighting with Drax and he's like, you know, I didn't ask to be made. Like there's just deep emotional kind of undertones to each character's story. And then like, don't even get me started on the We Are Groot scene. I was in tears because a tree died. A tree that can only say 3 words, which, you know, I just think, while I think Tony Stark has a good story in Iron Man 1, you know, he's kind of this James Bond-esque figure, you know, likes to indulge in the finer things of life, women, alcohol, the whole 9 yards. And, you know, when he finds out that his weapons are ending up in the wrong hands, of course he wants to do something about it. But I just think in terms of like, you know, like an emotional core, that just doesn't quite hit as hard to me as what we got in Guardians 1. So I do think you make a good point of Iron Man being a more iconic performance. But at least like that movie versus this movie, I do think it's, I guess I would say a little bit more emotionally shallow of a story.
So you brought up a point about the whole Infinity Saga being the Tony Stark show. I definitely think he's one of the faces of the series, but I would say like Steve Rogers and Captain America is equally as important in this saga. I would also say that I wouldn't even say that his development throughout all those movies is what made him iconic. I think the first movie alone did a lot of the groundwork. And I think he has a very defined, clear, and satisfying character arc in that first movie that honestly, you could argue his development after that movie didn't change. I mean, he does the sacrifice in Endgame. The beginning of that first movie, he's like just such an asshole. And then by the end of that movie, like him declaring I am Iron Man, he's come like completely full circle. And I feel like he's changed so much throughout the course of that movie, became a lot less selfish and a lot more selfless. And I think that his arc just in the first movie alone is just terrifically done. I wouldn't argue that Iron Man trilogy is better than the Guardians trilogy. I'm not even going to try. You could argue that the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and 3, I feel like there is an argument to be made that Guardians 1 isn't the best of the trilogy, whereas I feel like Iron Man is the clear-cut winner in its individual series. I just feel like that movie... Okay, here's where I think I'm going to win. I'm gonna cut straight to it, because this is the thing I was preparing. I think the villain of Iron Man is leaps and bounds better than Guardians of the Galaxy. I feel like some people give a little bit of flack to Obadiah Stane as a villain, and I don't think he's as good a villain as like, you know, the Joker or some other superhero movie, but I do think he's a very well-developed villain. Jeff Bridges is absolutely fantastic in that role. He's a great actor, obviously. But I feel like his motivations are very clear-cut in that movie. There's no, like, I feel like Ronan, is that his name? In Guardians of the Galaxy, it's just such a cardboard cutout villain. It just has like no personality other being like angry and wanting the stone. I feel like they really just dropped the ball on making a compelling villain in Guardians of the Galaxy, because they did such a good job with that main team that they just kind of like, I don't know, they didn't really develop the villain very well at all. Whereas I feel like in Iron Man that his motivations, Obadiah, are very clear cut. I also feel like he's a very intimidating presence, which I think is something that is lacking with the Guardians villain as well. Like, I never was that scared of him as a force. Yeah, sure, he's got like that hammer or whatever, but he just seemed like a blue cartoon character. Whereas I feel like that intensity of like that moment where Obadiah removes the arc reactor from Tony Stark and he's kind of leaning over him, like that scared me. Like that was genuinely pretty, I mean, a lot of that's due to how good of an actor Jeff Bridges is, but I feel like nothing in Guardians of the Galaxy with Ronan ever came close to being more intimidating or scary than that moment. And I also just feel like his motivations are much stronger and clearer and better written.
I think if you asked people the weakest aspect of both of these movies, there's a decent chance that they would say the villain for both of them. And I think kind of the MCU started an interesting trend, especially in like big action films, of the villains kind of not really being defined characters and more so just kind of being this like empty shell to push the narrative and like the character arcs of our heroes forward. And I think Ronan works in pretty well in that way because the movie that he's in and the main characters he's surrounded by are just really good. So I think to an extent, a lot of MCU villains are only as good as their like sound bites allow them to be, because inherently they're kind of empty shell characters that are really just there to kind of service the plot and move it forward. And I guess I would say Obadiah Stane, while he's a little bit more developed than Ronan, kind of falls into that trend as well, where he doesn't get a ton of screen time, and like rightfully so. Like obviously the name of the movie's Iron Man, Tony Stark is front and center. And I would say, in a way, they both kind of serve the same purpose of, you know, serving as this kind of force that forces our main character to develop and better and is just kind of that final roadblock for them to clear. I think they both kind of do that role good enough. I think they're both kind of, at best, mid-tier-ish MCU villains.
Does Ronan ever have a line better than Tony Stark built this in a cave with a box of scraps? No. Can you name one Ronan quote? I think maybe he said, "I will defeat you." Like, just a real, just weak villain overall. No screen presence. Not memorable at all.
I would agree with that, but I will say, he presents a bigger threat in the sense that he can wipe out an entire planet. Versus, like, obviously, like, Obadiah Stane's plan is nefarious in nature and not good for Earth. But it's not going to necessarily lead to like the destruction of Earth imminently, whereas like Ronan like was like seconds away from like destroying all of Xandar. And also we do get our first real glimpse of Thanos in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, which I do think actually aids the villain department, where I think part of the reason Ronan, kind of like you were saying, has that lack of screen presence is because, you know, he's subservient to Thanos.
Okay, you may have Thanos in that movie, but Iron Man has the first appearance of Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury at the end of the credits. I mean, which one of those was more exciting? I mean, come on. I'm here to talk to you about a team or whatever he said. That was awesome. And we all knew the Avengers was coming right after that. I'd also like to get into some of the individual aspects of what makes Iron Man such a good movie. As while I do agree that the Guardians did a great job developing all those characters and creating an emotional bond with them, I do think that the individual scenes in Iron Man are a lot stronger and more memorable. I think the action is a lot better. There's a lot of great scenes, such as the first flight with the Mark II. Really exciting scene. I feel like the excitement of being a hero is really felt in that scene, and it's just very memorable. The music, the Game of Thrones composer did the soundtrack, did an excellent job. And then also the scene where he is getting attacked by the fighter jets, the opening scene where he gets attacked by the terrorists. I feel like there's a lot of really exciting, intense action scenes, whereas I feel like the individual action scenes in Guardians of the Galaxy 1 aren't that memorable. I feel like they become more memorable in the sequels. Like, the one I always think about is the whistle arrow with Yondu in the second one. They've become a lot better in the sequels. I feel like the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie doesn't have as many memorable, exciting, singular action scenes.
I think Guardians of the Galaxy is a more visually interesting and distinct film. I know you talked about the soundtrack a little bit. I don't think we want to get into a soundtrack battle, because I would argue Guardians of the Galaxy might be the best soundtrack.
AC/DC. Back in Black.
But also, like, it's just such a vibrant and colorful film. There's a lot of creativity also in like the kind of like settings that we get. Like, we literally have part of the film set on a severed celestial head. Mm-hmm. Like, I think there's, while maybe Iron Man has a little bit more distinct action scenes in it, I think Guardians kind of makes up for that in the creativity of the settings, how colorful it is. I think it's a better directed film personally. But then also, I just think, to kind of circle back a little bit to the villain topic, you also get Nebula, Yondu, and Gamora, who all kind of tween the line of like anti-hero / villain. So I actually think in totality, because you get a little bit of Thanos, Nebula, Yondu, Gamora, and Ronan, I think as kind of like a conglomerate, it would be better than Obadiah Stane, because like Iron Man 1 is really just kind of like it's like, yes, he gets captured by like obviously the evil terrorist forces who end up just like working with Obadiah. So it's kind of like a 1v1 in a sense, whereas Guardians has more of that. A lot of these characters are kind of tweening the line between good guy. Really, the whole group kind of tweens the line between good guy and bad guy. So I think that kind of dynamic helps the movie to where, yes, Ronan doesn't necessarily stand out, but I think it's a little intentional because it would feel a little weird to have this like really standout villain when, you know, your main characters are all kind of a little nefarious in nature, you know, are criminals to a certain extent.
I think Guardians of the Galaxy lays the foundation for a strong supporting cast of antagonists, but none of them are standing out in this movie the way they do in future movies. I think Thanos doesn't become a good presence until like arguably Infinity War. Nebula became a good character, but I don't think it was in Guardians 1. I think they have a lot of these individual cameos of characters that would end up being good down the line. Whereas I feel like the characters that come out in Iron Man, we got Tony Stark, Pepper, Obadiah, even Happy Hogan, big fan. I feel like they all kind of make their mark right off the bat. Whereas even though you can give a lot of credit to Guardians for laying the groundwork for like even like the Infinity Stones, I don't think those things become as interesting, memorable until later down the line in the franchise. So I'll give it some credit, but if we're talking a 1-to-1 movie comparison, I think what's in this individual Guardians of the Galaxy first movie is not as strong as what becomes later. And I feel like that kind of proves that it had potential and could have done more with those characters in the first movie. I would also argue that the cinematography and the color palette of the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie is not as good as the later movies as well. I feel like it becomes more colorful once we get to those sequels, but I feel like it follows a very like bluish gray color palette. There is a lot of creativity in it, but I think the cinematography and the visuals become stronger later down the line as well. And while, like I said, I think it's far and away a better trilogy than Iron Man, I mean, that's not saying much. But I actually don't hate Iron Man 3, to be honest. I think it has some good aspects, but that's not what we're talking about right now. I think it's a stronger trilogy and more consistent overall. But I think a 1-to-1 movie comparison, Iron Man's just pulling all the punches right out the gate and just delivering every aspect of that movie to its fullest potential.
I don't really think Pepper Potts, Happy Hogan, or Terrence Howard's character.
Oh, Rhodes. I didn't even mention him. Oh, yeah, because it wasn't Don Cheadle. That's right.
I don't really think any of them have like a super iconic moment from the first Iron Man movie. Even Obadiah Stane, I would say his most iconic moment is kind of like a more comedic, jokey scene where he's like, Tony Stark built this in a cave with a box of scraps.
That's a great quote.
It is. So don't get me wrong, but I don't actually think like when I think of Happy Hogan, I don't really think of any moment from Iron Man 1. Same with Pepper Potts and obviously Rhodes, since he's a completely different actor.
I can't believe I didn't mention him.
Whereas I do think like Groot's best moment in the entire MCU happens in this first movie. I think arguably
Baby Groot, though.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on Baby Groot, to be honest. Like, I think he's cute.
I like him.
You know, it's like a fun gag here and there, but I do think that like Groot's sacrifice is arguably the best Groot moment. I think the end of the movie, like Take My Hand, Peter, is arguably Star-Lord's best moment. At least to me, the moment I most emotionally resonate with. The opening of the film, I think, is super iconic. Not the cold open, but like once we flash forward in time and he kind of is singing and dancing to Come and Get Your Love.
It's a good scene. It's a good scene.
Super iconic. Like, I do think there are actually iconic moments, and some of the characters have arguably their best moment in this first film. Also, I think it's arguably a funnier movie. Like, arguably my favorite joke in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe happens when Drax has the great line where he's like, nothing could go over my head. My reflexes are too fast. I would catch it.
Drax is great. Drax is great.
Drax is such a funny character. And it's like that kind of humor where it's like, it's distinct in the MCU because he just doesn't understand sarcasm. So it's almost like because he's not intentionally being quippy, it like just kind of comes off differently than anything else in the MCU, where it's like just a sense of humor of like you're kind of laughing at this person because he's so direct and like just like doesn't understand certain things. Like, I guess you could say the first Thor movie had a tiny bit of that, but I think this is like that, but like kind of perfected, if that makes sense.
I actually think that I want to go back to Pepper. I actually think that her connection with Tony Stark and their romance in the first movie is actually very compelling. I wouldn't say it's a romance for the ages or anything, but they have very good chemistry, and I feel like their relationship is very easy to get behind. And they do a good job building their connection throughout that movie, and I feel like that is kind of the emotional core of that movie, is like them having each other's backs and taking care of each other. And I found that to be very strong, even though Gwyneth Paltrow doesn't remember what Marvel movie she's in. You wouldn't know that. I think she does a good job, especially in that first movie, in creating that relationship with Tony. I also feel like the editing and the comedy behind the editing in Iron Man is always something I've really enjoyed. One of the scenes I think of is like at the beginning when Obadiah is talking about how great Tony is. He's at like a benefit or a gala or something, and he's supposed to be there. He's like, oh, Tony's so responsible, or whatever he said, and then it hard cuts to him like throwing the dice. And I just feel like the editing in that movie is doing a lot of the heavy lifting as well. And I feel like that may speak to it being better directed as well. I feel like the visual storytelling is really, really strong in Iron Man. And in that it's not just the words they're saying. I think that the editing and the way the movie's directed is doing a lot of the heavy lifting as well, which speaks to how good of a director Jon Favreau is. I don't know what he was doing during Iron Man 2. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he took a nap, but I do think he's a very strong director. Elf is actually one of my favorite movies as well. I've always really liked his work. So
I think you kind of made an interesting point about kind of the romance between Pepper and Tony being, the emotional core of the first Iron Man movie. I would more so say the emotional core of the movie is kind of Tony's, I guess, coming to
transformation.
And him kind of realizing the damage that his weapons are doing and kind of reforming himself. Also, I think there's a decent argument that Gamora and Star-Lord's kind of will they, won't they love story might be better, at least in the first two movies. Because I really you get that great moment where Peter risks his life to put the mask on Gamora and he is slowly dying in space. I think that's a pretty good moment. Mm-hmm. Followed by a really funny moment where after Yondu picks them up, he's like, yeah, I found something really heroic within me. And I think they have a really fun dynamic where it's in a conventional film where they would kiss and kind of solidify their feelings for each other, it kind of never really happens. When he puts the headphones on her and she's listening to the music, they're about to kiss, but then she pulls the knife on him. I think it's a fun dynamic between the two where it's again, in a more kind of conventional MCU film, they would just fall in love and, it'd be a little bit more straightforward. And I guess that also kind of goes back to the villain dynamic of all of these characters are kind of at best chaotic neutral. So not really knowing how they're going to react to certain things, to me, makes it a little bit more of a distinct film than Iron Man, where, don't get me wrong, I love Iron Man. I remember I was 8 years old and I saw it in theaters and fell in love with Tony Stark as a character. But I do think it is a more straightforward film where it's kind of this morally ambiguous character kind of becomes a still egotistical but good guy by the end. Whereas Guardians of the Galaxy is, all of these characters are, like I said, chaotic neutral at best. And I'd say they end the film as kind of chaotic neutral.
Yeah, I was actually going to step in. So, one thing about Pepper is I do feel like, although the emotional core of Iron Man is Iron Man himself, I feel like Pepper is the one who grounds him, and she's extremely key in that realm. And also, with your comment on the will they, won't they of Peter and Gamora, I actually would argue that Iron Man has that as well. There's a little bit of flirtation between them, but I don't think that's fully sealed by the end of the first movie. And then actually the part when it kind of subverts you a bit and they're actually not kiss and totally fine, is actually in Iron Man as well. I think it's right at the end before he goes out to the press conference when they're having this really sweet moment. She's getting him ready, and then she's like, I forget what they're saying. And then she's like, oh, and then you left me on the roof and I was alone. He's like, yeah, that moment. And then they just go out. So it's like, there is a little bit of that will they, won't they in Iron Man as well. Actually, I didn't even think of this before, but you are right. Those are kind of similar dynamics, the romances in both movies. And I would also argue for comparing Peter Quill to Tony Stark. I feel like Peter Quill is kind of a Tony Stark-esque character in a way that Tony Stark laid the groundwork for him. He's kind of like that, like, I don't know if necessarily, he's not an anti-hero, but he's like a bit of a selfish womanizer, jerk, like wisecracking. But I also feel like A, Tony Stark did it first and better. And B, I feel like Tony Stark's development in the first film, like his character arc is much stronger than anything Peter Quill goes through. I think he has the emotional connection with his mom, but I don't know that Peter Quill is as different or as developed in the first movie as Tony Stark Iron Man is in the first movie.
Yeah, I would disagree with that a little bit because, like, I think the emotional core of his arc kind of helps him become, I don't know if I would say a more developed character than Tony Stark, but I would say maybe an equally developed character as Tony Stark, where he has that great moment with Yondu about halfway through the movie where Yondu's like, my guys wanted to eat you, boy. They never tasted terror before. And he's like, well, yeah, like, you're not supposed to eat me. And I think Peter Quill kind of has an interesting arc where it's like he almost kind of learns what it means to be human in a way, because he was abducted from Earth at such a young age after such like an emotionally traumatic moment. He kind of learns human kindness and like what it means to have a family throughout the movie. I don't know if I would say it's more iconic than Tony Stark's character arc in the first movie, but I do think because it's so emotionally rich and deep and relatable, like, cause, you know, like personally, I'm not a James Bond-esque figure, you know, I'm not rolling dice at the table and, you know, I wouldn't personally say I'm a womanizer. So I do think there's a bit of like, while I really enjoy Tony Stark as a character and his arc in that first movie, if we're talking about relatability, there's kind of like a roadblock there where it's like, I can admire and appreciate it, but in terms of like actually like relating to and connecting on that kind of deeper emotional level, Peter Quill is, I guess, a more human arc, I would say. I'd say we probably have both made some pretty good points. So I guess, do you have any kind of final points to kind of really hammer home why you think Iron Man 1 is the best MCU film?
Yeah, overall, I would just say that they're both really strong origin stories. Definitely two of the best Marvel movies. I knew this was going to be a tough debate coming in because I think we both really like these movies a lot. And I don't think they're that far from quality, but I do think Iron Man did just lay the groundwork for the MCU and just came out swinging with a stronger character. Just, I would say, better action, better directed, better villain, and just overall holds up to this day. And all these years of movies and TV shows later, I still think it's the strongest output from the MCU, even though there's been other good movies. Tony Stark, man, all the way.
Yeah, no, I coming into this, I knew this was going to be a tough one because I would say these are both probably top 3 MCU movies for me. Like, for a very long time, Iron Man was my favorite, partially because it's just a really good movie, and then also partially because, you know, I remember being an impressionable 8-year-old in the movie theater opening weekend, seeing Iron Man, and really that was kind of one of my first, like, big box office like movies that I had seen in the theater. So that is one of my kind of like defining movie theater experiences.
I did not see Iron Man in the theater. I really wish I had, though.
Funny kind of side story. Like, the post-credit scene wasn't really a developed thing.
So you didn't see it?
Everyone left.
Yeah, I bet.
Everyone left.
Why wouldn't you?
I did not know that the post-credit scene happened until I rented the movie from Blockbuster, like 6 months after it came out. And, I think I left to get a snack, like, after, like, the final scene, and then all of a sudden I heard Samuel L. Jackson's voice, and I'm like, what? But yeah, I guess kind of circling back to, my final thoughts on Guardians of the Galaxy. I guess for me, the reason I would edge it over Iron Man 1 is just, I do think it has a better emotional core that I can kind of relate to more. I think it has more characters that kind of have deep thematic arcs and deep kind of emotional moments. So I do think you get a bit of an ensemble cast versus kind of a bit of a one-man show in Iron Man. And then also I think it's a bit of a more visually distinct film, a little bit more colorful. The soundtrack is phenomenal. I think it just has a little kind of small edges over Iron Man to where I would say it is a slightly better movie. But again, two of the best in MCU without a doubt. So if you made it this far, please let us know in the comments. A, who do you think won the debate? And B, which do you think is a better movie? Iron Man 1 or Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1? Also, if you don't think either of these movies are the best MCU film, which one do you think it is? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is going to be a series that I'm going to try to do on the channel at least 2 times a month where, I have a friend on, we get into some kind of nerdy movie-related debate. So if you enjoyed this, there will be a playlist linked in the description with all of my movie debates videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.
I actually thought of one more thing I wanted to say. I forgot about this 10 minutes ago. If you don't want to include this in the video,
Post-credit scene.
You don't have to. If you just want me to shut up, that's fine.
It's all good.
I was going to say that I don't think that necessarily having the most emotionally investing characters necessarily makes them the best characters. I think a lot of filmmakers like a Scorsese or a Tarantino who are showcasing all these really amazing characters that are like total assholes. I mean, I think you just need to have, and I'm not saying like, the Goodfellas characters are on the same level as Tony Stark. My point is like, I think sometimes the best movie characters are like the most memorable and engaging just from a viewer standpoint and not necessarily the most emotionally investing.